The most dangerous prison is not the one that takes away your freedom. It is the one you build yourself while believing you are completely free. That sounds backwards. After all, freedom is supposed to be the answer. Freedom is what people fight for, dream about, and celebrate. We are taught that the more freedom we have, the closer we get to happiness. More choices. More independence. More control over our own lives. But what if one of the oldest spiritual warnings ever written suggests the opposite? What if freedom, by itself, is not liberation? What if freedom without self-mastery becomes a force of self-destruction? And what if that warning is hidden inside one of the most iconic figures in world literature, not as a character, not as a hero, but as an archetype of the human mind itself? Most people look at the Monkey King and see rebellion. They see courage. They see the refusal to bow before authority. But that may be the first misunderstanding. Because the deeper question is not why he challenged the world around him. The deeper question is why someone who seemed impossible to control could never fully control himself. And that question is far more relevant today than it was centuries ago. Think about the modern world. Never before in human history have so many people possessed so much personal freedom. We can express ourselves instantly. We can reinvent our identities. We can consume endless information, entertainment, and stimulation with a device that fits in the palm of our hand. Yet anxiety rises. Attention fragments. Addiction spreads. Meaning becomes harder to find. How is that possible? How can a civilization gain more freedom and simultaneously feel more lost? That contradiction is where our journey begins. Because the Monkey King is not merely a figure from an ancient text. He represents something alive inside every human being. A force that wants movement without restraint. Power without limits. Expression without discipline. In Buddhist thought, one of the greatest challenges is not defeating an enemy outside yourself. It is understanding the restless mind within yourself. A mind that jumps from desire to desire. A mind that resists boundaries. A mind that mistakes impulse for freedom. And perhaps that is why the monkey remains such a powerful symbol. Not because he is extraordinary, but because he is familiar. His struggle is hidden inside our own. Here is a memory worth holding onto, a king who could rule everything except himself. At first, it sounds like a paradox. But the more closely you examine human nature, the more terrifying it becomes. Because history is filled with people who conquered markets, organizations, industries, and nations while remaining strangers to their own minds. External victory often creates the illusion of inner mastery. But those are not the same thing. And when we confuse them, the consequences can be enormous. A second image emerges: freedom without discipline is a sword without a handle. Eventually, the person holding it becomes the one who gets hurt. The strange thing is that very few people fear this outcome. Most people fear being controlled by others. Few stop to ask whether they are already controlled by impulses they barely understand. By cravings. By pride. By anger. By validation. By the endless need to prove something. What if the greatest threat to freedom is not authority? What if the greatest threat to freedom is the ego pretending to be freedom? That possibility changes everything. Because now the question is no longer political. It becomes psychological. It becomes spiritual. And it becomes deeply personal. A final image remains: the strongest cage is not made of iron. It is made of identity. You cannot escape a prison you mistake for yourself. And that raises a disturbing possibility that most people never consider. Maybe the real purpose of freedom is not to do whatever we want. Maybe the real purpose of freedom is to reveal whether we are capable of governing ourselves. And if that is true, then the Monkey King was never merely a symbol of freedom. He may have been a warning about what happens when freedom arrives before wisdom. But to understand that warning, we first need to confront the meaning most people see on the surface, and why that surface meaning may hide the exact opposite lesson underneath. The surface interpretation seems obvious: the Monkey King represents freedom. But what if that is only the first layer of the symbol? The deeper we look, the stranger it becomes. Because genuine symbols survive for centuries not because they tell us what we already know, but because they hide truths that are difficult to face. And one of the most uncomfortable truths about human nature is that we rarely recognize the difference between freedom and resistance. At first glance, they look identical. Both reject limitations. Both push against boundaries. Both refuse obedience. Yet spiritually, they are worlds apart. A person can resist every authority on earth and still remain a prisoner of anger. A person can break every external chain and still be controlled by pride. A person can reject every rule and still be incapable of governing their own mind. That is the contradiction hidden beneath the archetype. The monkey is not simply the symbol of liberation. The monkey is the symbol of untamed potential. An untamed potential is one of the most dangerous forces in human life. Why? Because strength without direction creates chaos. Intelligence without wisdom creates arrogance. Freedom without self-observation creates self-deception. Notice how often this pattern appears in modern life. People spend years pursuing independence only to become dependent on approval. They escape old systems only to become trapped by new obsessions. They reject external control only to discover they are being directed by impulses they never understood. The prison changed shape. But the prison remained. And that leads us toward a deeper symbolic layer. In Buddhist psychology, one of the greatest obstacles is not suffering itself. It is attachment. Not attachment to possessions alone. Attachment to identity. Attachment to being right. Attachment to being powerful. Attachment to the image we create of ourselves. This is where the monkey archetype becomes unsettling. Because the most difficult attachment to recognize is the attachment to freedom itself. That sounds impossible. How can freedom become an attachment? Because anything that strengthens the ego can become an attachment. Even noble ideals. Even personal growth. Even the desire to be limitless. A revealing question emerges here: what if the desire to become completely unconstrained is not always a sign of enlightenment? What if, in some cases, it is simply the ego demanding a larger kingdom? That possibility changes the entire meaning of the symbol. Suddenly the conflict is no longer between the individual and authority. The conflict moves inward. The battlefield becomes psychological. The struggle becomes spiritual. And the consequences become much larger than one person. Because an undisciplined mind does not only affect itself. It affects families, communities, institutions, entire cultures. Scale shifts matter. A restless mind creates a restless life. Millions of restless minds create a restless civilization. Perhaps that is why modern society often feels trapped in a strange paradox. We possess more freedom than previous generations could have imagined. Yet many people feel increasingly overwhelmed, distracted, fragmented, and exhausted. The problem may not be a lack of freedom. The problem may be that freedom exposes whatever already exists within us. And if the inner world is chaotic, more freedom simply magnifies the chaos. Here is another image worth remembering. A storm does not create weakness in a building. It reveals weakness that was already there. Freedom operates the same way. It reveals the structure of the mind that receives it. Which means freedom itself may be neutral. The real question is whether the person holding it has developed the capacity to carry it. That realization introduces another memory fragment. The greatest cage is not made of iron. It is made of unconscious desire. Because a person who cannot see what drives them cannot truly choose where they are going. And now the symbol becomes even more mysterious. If the monkey represents untamed potential. If freedom reveals the hidden architecture of the mind. If attachment can disguise itself as liberation. Then perhaps the central problem was never power. Perhaps the central problem was something far more subtle. What if the force preventing true freedom is not the chain we can see? but the identity we refuse to question? And if that is true, then the next question becomes unavoidable. What exactly was the monkey protecting so fiercely that he could not let it go? What if the thing being protected was never freedom at all? What if it was identity? That possibility forces us into a much deeper contradiction. Because most people assume that suffering comes from losing who they are. Yet many spiritual traditions suggest the opposite. They suggest that some forms of suffering come from clinging too tightly to who we think we are. And that is where the shadow of the monkey archetype begins to emerge. Not the heroic shadow. Not the rebellious shadow. The deeper one. The shadow that appears whenever power and identity become fused together. Consider what happens when a person builds their entire sense of self around being intelligent, or successful, or independent, or different from everyone else. At first, these qualities feel empowering. They create confidence. They create momentum. They create purpose. But over time, something subtle begins to happen. The identity that once served the person starts demanding protection. And once identity demands protection, growth becomes dangerous. Why? Because real growth requires transformation. Transformation requires letting go. And letting go threatens the very image the ego has spent years constructing. This is the hidden crisis. The monkey archetype does not merely seek freedom from limitation. It seeks freedom without surrender. And that is a contradiction that cannot be sustained forever. Because every meaningful transformation asks the same question: what are you willing to leave behind? Not your possessions. Not your achievements. Your self-image. The version of yourself you have become attached to. This is why the symbol becomes increasingly psychological the deeper we examine it. The true conflict is not between strength and weakness. It is between identity and evolution. A memory fragment captures this perfectly. The heaviest burden is often the version of yourself you refuse to outgrow. Notice how this pattern appears everywhere in modern life. Organizations become trapped by their own success. Leaders become prisoners of their own reputation. Entire societies become attached to stories about themselves. The same force that creates greatness can eventually prevent growth. Scale shifts again. What begins inside one mind eventually spreads into families. Then institutions. Then cultures. Then civilizations. History repeatedly demonstrates the same paradox. The structures that create power often become the structures that resist change. And human beings are no different. The more deeply we identify with something, the more fiercely we defend it. Even when it is harming us. Especially when it is harming us. That is the psychological reversal most people never see. The ego does not always protect us from danger. Sometimes it protects the danger from us. Let that sit for a moment. Because it changes how we understand human behavior. People do not always resist truth because truth is painful. Sometimes they resist truth because truth threatens an identity they cannot imagine living without. This is where Buddhist philosophy introduces a radically different perspective. The greatest obstacle is not ignorance alone. The greatest obstacle is attachment to the illusion of a permanent self. Not because the self is evil. Not because individuality is wrong. But because anything treated as fixed eventually becomes a cage. And cages become invisible when we decorate them. Another memory fragment emerges: the strongest walls are the ones we mistake for our personality. That is why the spiritual dimension of this symbol is so unsettling. The challenge is not simply learning something new. The challenge is becoming someone capable of receiving what is new. Without that capacity, every revelation gets filtered through old desires. Every insight becomes fuel for old ambitions. Every victory strengthens the very pattern that needs to be transformed. The consequence is enormous. A person can spend decades pursuing freedom while unknowingly deepening the habits that prevent genuine liberation. A society can celebrate self-expression while becoming increasingly fragmented. A civilization can accumulate extraordinary power while losing the wisdom required to guide it. And perhaps this explains why external success alone never resolves the deeper problem. Because the crisis was never located outside. It was hidden inside the architecture of identity itself. But now an even stranger mystery begins to appear. If attachment to identity creates the cage, and if the ego survives by defending that identity, then why do human beings cling so fiercely to something that repeatedly limits them? What exactly is the mind afraid will happen if it finally lets go? What if the mind is not afraid of losing freedom? What if it is afraid of losing the illusion of control? That distinction may seem small, but it changes everything. Because the deeper symbolic function of the monkey archetype is not simply that it represents a powerful mind. It represents a mind that believes power alone is enough. And that belief is the revelation. Not the final revelation, but the one that begins to rearrange the entire picture. Throughout human history, people have searched for stronger tools, greater knowledge, larger audiences, faster technology, and more influence. We often assume that the next level of power will solve the problems created by the previous one. Yet something strange keeps happening. Human capability expands. Human wisdom does not always expand with it. The result is a growing imbalance. And the monkey archetype symbolizes that imbalance perfectly. Because the central issue is not strength. The central issue is relationship. Relationship to desire. Relationship to identity. Relationship to power. Relationship to the self. This is where the symbol begins to reveal its deepest psychological function. An untamed mind does not suffer because it lacks ability. It suffers because ability amplifies whatever already exists within it. If confusion exists, power magnifies confusion. If pride exists, power magnifies pride. If fear exists, power magnifies fear. Power is often mistaken for transformation. But power rarely transforms. Power reveals. That is the insight hidden beneath the archetype. A flashlight does not create what is in a dark room. It only exposes what was already there. Power works the same way. And that realization introduces a memory fragment worth carrying forward. The brighter the light, the harder it becomes to hide from yourself. Now the symbolism starts moving beyond individual psychology and into spiritual territory. Many people imagine spiritual growth as acquiring something new. More knowledge. More discipline. More enlightenment. But Buddhist philosophy often points in a different direction. Not addition. Subtraction. Not accumulation. Release. Not becoming something greater. Seeing through what was never truly yours in the first place. This is where the archetype becomes deeply uncomfortable. Because the ego loves improvement. The ego loves achievement. The ego loves becoming extraordinary. What the ego struggles with is dissolution. It struggles with surrender. It struggles with humility. Not because humility is weakness. Because humility removes the stage upon which the ego performs. That creates another reversal. The opposite of arrogance is not weakness. The opposite of arrogance is reality. And reality is often far less flattering than the stories we tell ourselves. Modern culture rarely encourages this realization. In many ways, it encourages the opposite. We are taught to build personal brands. Curate identities. Project images. Accumulate recognition. Construct increasingly elaborate versions of ourselves. Yet beneath that process lies a question few people ask. What happens when the person we perform becomes more important than the person we are? The consequences stretch far beyond individuals. Organizations become addicted to image. Institutions become addicted to status. Societies become addicted to narratives. Civilizations become addicted to expansion. The pattern repeats at every scale. A second memory fragment emerges. A mask worn long enough eventually forgets it is a mask. And that may be one of the most dangerous forms of attachment. Because once identity hardens into certainty, learning slows. Transformation slows. Wisdom slows. The system becomes rigid. Not only in people. In cultures. In entire eras of history. This is why the symbolic role of the monkey extends far beyond one archetype. It represents a universal tendency in human nature. The tendency to mistake capability for maturity. The tendency to mistake movement for progress. The tendency to mistake self-expression for self-understanding. And perhaps the greatest mistake of all, mistaking expansion for liberation. A final image begins to emerge from beneath the symbol. Imagine a person standing in an open field with no walls around them. No chains. No barriers. No visible limits. Yet they cannot stop running. Cannot stop proving. Cannot stop chasing. Cannot stop becoming. From the outside, they appear completely free. From the inside, they are being driven by something they have never examined. That is the revelation hidden beneath the revelation. The deepest prison may not be restraint. The deepest prison may be compulsion. And if that is true, then an even larger question appears. What if the real opposite of freedom is not control by others, but control by forces within ourselves that we do not even realize are there? So if the deepest prison is compulsion rather than restraint, what is the actual path out? This is where the symbol reveals its most important secret. And it is not the answer most people expect. Because the ultimate lesson hidden inside this archetype is not about becoming stronger. It is about becoming transparent to yourself. That is the core revelation. Most people assume that freedom is achieved when nothing can stop them. The deeper spiritual insight is that freedom begins when nothing inside them needs to dominate them. Those are completely different conditions. One is external. The other is internal. One measures power. The other measures clarity. And clarity may be the rarest form of freedom that exists. This is why the monkey archetype cannot be reduced to rebellion, intelligence, courage, or strength. Those are only surface expressions. Beneath them lies a much deeper pattern. Desire creates attachment. Attachment creates identity. Identity creates illusion. Illusion creates suffering. Suffering creates the search for freedom. But if the search itself is driven by the same illusion, the cycle simply repeats in a new form. That is the hidden architecture. And once you see it, the symbol transforms completely. The real challenge was never escaping limits. The real challenge was recognizing the mechanism that continuously creates new limits from within. A memory fragment captures this perfectly. A person can spend their entire life running from cages while carrying the blueprint for every cage they enter. That blueprint is not fate. It is unconscious attachment. The attachment to being admired. The attachment to being special. The attachment to being right. The attachment to being powerful. The attachment to preserving a particular image of oneself. Notice the paradox. The ego often promises liberation. But its survival depends upon maintaining attachment. And attachment is the very thing that prevents liberation. This is why the deepest layer of the symbol is neither psychological nor philosophical. It is spiritual. Because the issue is no longer behavior. It is perception. The question becomes, what are you seeing? And perhaps more importantly, what are you unable to see? In Buddhist thought, awakening is not primarily the acquisition of knowledge. It is the removal of distortion. Reality was always present. The problem was the lens. The lens of desire. The lens of fear. The lens of identity. The lens of self-centered interpretation. The moment that lens begins to weaken, something extraordinary happens. Power changes meaning. Freedom changes meaning. Success changes meaning. Even suffering changes meaning. Because they are no longer being filtered through the same illusion. This is the transformation most people miss. They imagine awakening as becoming a greater version of themselves. The deeper insight is almost the opposite. Awakening often begins when the obsession with becoming begins to dissolve. Another memory fragment emerges. The ocean becomes visible when the waves stop convincing themselves they are separate. This is not merely a spiritual statement. It has enormous consequences in modern life. A person trapped by status can never enjoy achievement. A person trapped by comparison can never enjoy success. A person trapped by identity can never experience genuine growth. Every accomplishment becomes another object to defend. Every victory becomes another burden to carry. And eventually, success itself becomes exhausting. Scale this pattern upward. Organizations become trapped by legacy. Nations become trapped by ideology. Civilizations become trapped by narratives about who they believe they are. The same attachment operating inside one mind eventually appears inside entire systems. This is why the archetype remains timeless. It is not describing one individual. It is describing a universal human pattern. The pattern of confusing expansion with awakening. The pattern of mistaking accumulation for transformation. The pattern of believing that more power will solve problems created by unconsciousness. Yet the symbol points somewhere else entirely. Toward self-observation. Toward clarity. Toward awareness. Toward a form of freedom that does not depend on winning, proving, controlling, or becoming. And that revelation creates a consequence far larger than the individual. Because if genuine freedom comes from seeing through attachment rather than satisfying it, then many of the systems modern society celebrates may be feeding the very cycle people are trying to escape. Which leads to an unsettling question. If attachment is not merely a personal problem but a force capable of shaping cultures, institutions, and entire civilizations, then what happens when millions of people build their lives around illusions they mistake for freedom? And what kind of world emerges from that collective misunderstanding? What remains after the illusion is seen? That is the question every meaningful transformation eventually faces. Because insight alone changes very little. A person can recognize a pattern and still repeat it. A society can understand a danger and still celebrate it. A civilization can inherit wisdom and still ignore it. The real measure of revelation is not what it explains. It is what it leaves behind. And that is where the legacy of this archetype begins. The deepest consequence is not that attachment creates suffering. The deepest consequence is that attachment quietly reshapes reality itself. It influences what we notice, what we pursue, what we reward, what we fear. Over time, entire lives become organized around unconscious priorities. And when millions of people share the same unconscious priorities, those priorities become culture. This is why the symbolic influence extends far beyond the individual. The pattern does not stop at the level of personal psychology. It scales. A person attached to status creates anxiety. An organization attached to status creates dysfunction. A society attached to status creates endless comparison. The same force appears at every level. Only the size changes. A memory fragment captures this transformation. A single spark can warm a home. A forest fire begins with the same flame. Human desires operate in a similar way. Small attachments shape individual choices. Collective attachments shape entire civilizations. And perhaps this explains one of the defining paradoxes of modern life. Never before have so many people had access to information. Yet confusion remains widespread. Never before have so many people had opportunities for self-expression. Yet loneliness remains common. Never before have so many people had tools for connection. Yet disconnection continues to grow. The problem may not be technological. It may not even be political. The problem may be that external progress cannot compensate for internal fragmentation. This is the legacy hidden beneath the archetype. The lesson was never anti-freedom. It was never anti-power. It was never anti-achievement. The lesson concerns relationship. How do human beings relate to these things? Do they use them consciously? Or do they become used by them? That distinction determines everything. Another memory fragment emerges. The strongest cage is not made of iron. It is made of rewards that slowly become necessities. At first, a desire feels optional. Then it feels important. Then it feels essential. Eventually, life begins revolving around it. This process rarely announces itself. It happens gradually, quietly, almost invisibly, which is why its consequences are so difficult to recognize. The symbolic legacy of the monkey archetype is therefore not merely personal discipline. It is self-awareness. The capacity to observe desire before desire becomes identity. The capacity to recognize attachment before attachment becomes destiny. The capacity to see the difference between movement and direction. Because movement alone guarantees nothing. An entire civilization can move rapidly while heading toward confusion. An individual can remain busy for decades while avoiding the most important questions of life. Scale shifts once again. The same pattern appears in economics, in politics, in media, in education, in technology. Systems often become extraordinarily efficient at producing what people want. Much less efficient at asking whether those wants are leading anywhere meaningful. That is why this archetype continues to matter centuries later. Not because it belongs to a particular culture. Not because it belongs to a particular story. But because it reveals something permanent about human nature. Human beings possess an extraordinary ability to transform the world. The greater challenge has always been transforming themselves. And perhaps that is the most enduring legacy of all. A civilization can build towering cities, advanced technologies, powerful institutions, remarkable achievements. Yet if the minds creating them remain driven by unconscious attachment, the same patterns simply reappear in new forms. Larger forms. More sophisticated forms. More influential forms. But fundamentally the same. A final memory fragment remains. A person may escape every visible wall and still spend a lifetime walking in circles. Not because the path is blocked. Because the pattern is unseen. And that leaves us with a mystery that still refuses to disappear. If awareness is the beginning of freedom, if attachment quietly shapes individuals, societies, and civilizations, if the greatest obstacles often operate beneath conscious perception, then how can anyone know whether they are truly awake? Or whether they have simply constructed a more comfortable illusion and mistaken it for freedom? Perhaps that is why this archetype continues to endure long after the details surrounding it have faded into the background. Not because it offers answers. Because it refuses to let us escape certain questions. The deeper legacy is not found in what the symbol accomplishes. It is found in what it reveals about us. Every generation inherits new technologies, new institutions, new opportunities, new freedoms. Yet beneath all those changes, the same human patterns continue to reappear. The desire to become more. The fear of becoming less. The longing for significance. The attachment to identity. The struggle to distinguish what is real from what merely feels important. The archetype survives because those struggles survive. Its true role was never to represent a particular individual. Its role was to hold up a mirror. And mirrors can be uncomfortable. Because they do not only reflect our strengths, they reveal the places where we remain divided from ourselves. A memory fragment remains suspended over the entire journey, a king who could rule everything except himself. The longer you sit with that image, the less it feels like a myth. And the more it begins to feel like a description of ordinary life. Many people learn how to manage careers before they learn how to manage desire. Many learn how to influence others before they learn how to understand themselves. Many learn how to build an identity before they learn how to question one. Perhaps that inversion explains much of the confusion of modern existence. We spend tremendous energy shaping the outer world while remaining uncertain about the forces shaping the inner one. And so the symbolic meaning expands beyond psychology, beyond philosophy, into something fundamentally spiritual. Because the deepest transformation is not about becoming a different person. It is about relating differently to the person you already believe yourself to be. That shift sounds subtle. Yet entire traditions of wisdom have been built around it. Not because identity must be destroyed, but because identity was never meant to become a prison. Not because desire must disappear, but because desire was never meant to become a master. Not because freedom is dangerous, but because freedom without awareness can quietly become another form of bondage. Another memory fragment emerges. The prison with no walls is the hardest one to recognize. And perhaps that is why genuine awakening has always been described less as achievement and more as seeing. Seeing clearly. Seeing honestly. Seeing without the distortions created by fear, attachment, pride, or craving. Because what is seen clearly loses much of its power to control us. What remains hidden continues to shape us. This realization carries a legacy far beyond any single symbol. It applies to individuals, to families, to organizations, to nations, even to civilizations. The greatest challenges are rarely the ones standing directly in front of us. They are often the assumptions operating quietly underneath us. The stories we never question. The desires we never examine. The identities we never outgrow. And perhaps that is why the final lesson feels less like a conclusion and more like an invitation to reflection. Not a reflection on an ancient figure. A reflection on ourselves. Because somewhere inside every human being exists the same tension. The tension between power and wisdom. Between desire and awareness. Between movement and direction. Between the self we protect and the truth we avoid. A final memory remains. A person may spend a lifetime searching for freedom in distant places, only to discover that the decisive battle was never about distance at all. It was about seeing. Seeing what drives them. Seeing what binds them. Seeing what they have mistaken for themselves. And perhaps the deepest irony is this: the mind spends so much time trying to escape limits that it rarely asks whether the one holding the key has been standing inside the cage all along. If true freedom begins the moment illusion is recognized, then the question that remains is not whether we are free. The question is far more unsettling: how much of what we call freedom is actually freedom, and how much of it is simply a version of ourselves that we have never learned to see?